Did a silver blade really save an entire village from a werewolf's reign of terror? What about the tale of a hairy child, ostracized and accused in a 17th century Swiss town? Or perhaps you've heard whispers of a French village that took justice into its own hands, hunting down suspected werewolves among them. Rejoice and let out a howl, my werewolf friends, because today we're doing 3 extra long stories crafted just for you. Welcome back to 2 Tricks, 1 Treat, where we delve into the most spine-chilling stories from history, folklore, and sometimes the depths of our own imagination. But here's the catch. Only one of these werewolf tales is true. The other 2 are pure fiction. Can you sniff out the real story from the myths? If you're a fan of the strange, paranormal, and mysterious, you've come to the right place. We release a new video every day exploring these very topics. So if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button to join us on this hair-raising journey. Now let's begin. Story 1, The Hairy Child of St. Gallen. In the heart of 17th century Switzerland, nestled amidst the towering Alps and verdant meadows, lay the quaint town of St. Gallen. Cobblestone streets wound their way through clusters of timber-framed houses, each adorned with flower boxes that burst with color even in the chill of winter. The town square was the hub of community life, where market stalls brimmed with fresh produce, handcrafted goods, and the latest gossip. But beneath the idyllic surface, a darker undercurrent flowed through the town's collective consciousness, an ancient fear rooted in folklore and superstition. In St. Gallen, as in many European towns of the era, tales of werewolves were more than mere bedtime stories designed to frighten children. They were cautionary tales, whispered warnings that spoke of creatures who could transform from human to wolf under the light of the full moon. These mythical beings were said to possess an insatiable hunger for flesh, and their malevolent deeds were the stuff of countless fireside tales. The notion of werewolves was so deeply ingrained in the town's psyche that even the rustling of leaves on a windless night could send shivers down the spines of the bravest souls. It was in this atmosphere of concealed dread that the story of the hairy child of St. Gallen began, a tale that would test the boundaries of belief, compassion, and the human capacity for both love and cruelty. In the year 1632, a woman named Elise gave birth to a baby girl in the humble confines of her cottage. The midwives attending the birth exchanged uneasy glances as they beheld the newborn. The child was covered in an unusually thick layer of hair, her tiny arms and legs more reminiscent of a furred creature than a human baby. Even her cherubic face was framed by a fine layer of downy hair. Word of the extraordinary birth spread like wildfire through the town. Doctors, who were more accustomed to balancing humors than understanding genetics, were baffled. They consulted medical texts and debated heatedly, but no explanation could be found. The townspeople, however, needed no scientific reason to form their own conclusions. Murmurs turned into accusations, and accusations into a collective judgment. Elise and her daughter must be werewolves. The town council convened an emergency meeting, and though no one could point to any harm done by the mother or child, the verdict was unanimous. Fueled by fear and superstition, they ruled that Elise and her daughter were to be ostracized, forced to live on the very outskirts of St. Gallen, far removed from the heart of the community they had once called home. Elise, holding her infant daughter close, watched with tearful eyes as their belongings were hastily packed onto a cart. As they made their way to the edge of town, the faces that once greeted them warmly now turned away, doors and windows shutting tight as if to ward off evil spirits. And so, mother and daughter began their life in exile, in a ramshackle dwelling at the edge of the forest, a place where the boundary between human civilization and the untamed wilderness seemed to blur, much like the lines on the faces of the townspeople who had cast them out. As the years passed, the girl, whom Elise had named Lena, grew into a young woman. Her hairiness did not diminish with age. If anything, it became more pronounced, a constant reminder of the town's suspicions. Living on the outskirts of St. Gallen, Lena had little interaction with other children, but the few times she ventured into town for supplies were enough to scar her deeply. Children who had been taught to fear her would growl and howl as she walked by, mimicking the wolves they believed she consorted with. Adults were no better, casting sidelong glances and making the sign of the cross as if she were some unholy apparition. The market vendors would hurriedly attend to her, keen to see her leave. Every growl, every howl, every averted gaze was a cut, and Lena wore her scars on the inside, hidden beneath her unusual exterior. One fateful autumn day, the town of St. Gallen was thrown into chaos. A group of children who had gone into the woods to gather berries failed to return home. Search parties were organized, torches were lit, and the forest was combed, but no trace of the children could be found. Panic gripped the community and fingers were quickly pointed. Without a shred of evidence, the town's suspicion fell squarely on Lena. Whispers turned into open accusations. It must have been her, in her werewolf form, who took our children. The town's long-held fears seemed to be confirmed, and a frenzied mob gathered demanding justice, or what they considered to be justice. Elise and Lena, who had heard about the missing children but had no inkling they would be blamed, were shocked when a group of angry townspeople arrived at their doorstep. Torches flickered menacingly as the crowd chanted for Lena to be brought to trial. The die had been cast and Lena's fate seemed sealed. The trial was held in the town square, a makeshift courtroom assembled under the open sky as if heaven itself were to bear witness. The jury was a collection of stern faces, already convinced of Lena's guilt. The judge, a portly man with a powdered wig, seemed equally predisposed, barely hiding his disdain as he looked at Lena and her mother. Elise stood beside her daughter, her eyes red from sleepless nights but determined. She pleaded with the crowd, recounting Lena's gentle nature, her love for animals, and her inability to even harm a fly. "My daughter is no monster. She is but a victim of your unfounded fears," Elise implored, but her words fell on deaf ears. The crowd was out for blood, and reason had long since abandoned the town square. The judge, eager to conclude the proceedings, barely allowed Elise to finish before announcing the verdict. In light of the grievous charges and the overwhelming agreement of the community, Lena is to be burned at the stake at dawn. "May God have mercy on her soul," he declared, banging a makeshift gavel. The sky was still dark when they came for Lena. Rough hands pulled her from her bed, offering no time for goodbyes. Her eyes searched frantically for her mother as they dragged her out of their humble home, but Elise was nowhere to be found. A sinking feeling of abandonment filled Lena's chest. The one person who had always been by her side seemed to have forsaken her in her final moments. Tied to a wooden stake in the center of the town square, Lena looked out at the gathering crowd. Faces that she had known all her life, faces that had scorned and ridiculed her, now gleamed with a mix of fear and anticipation. A pile of firewood was stacked around her feet, and a man with a torch stood by, awaiting the signal to light the pyre. The air was thick with tension, each second stretching into an eternity as Lena braced herself for the end. Her eyes scanned the crowd one last time, desperately searching for her mother. But Elise was still nowhere to be found, and a profound sense of loneliness engulfed Lena. Just when it seemed as though her life would be consumed by the flames of ignorance and hatred, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Just as the executioner approached with a lit torch, ready to set the pyre ablaze, a figure burst through the crowd, her face flushed and frantic. It was Elise, Lena's mother, and trailing behind her were the missing children, disheveled but unharmed. "I'm the one you should blame, not my daughter," Elise shouted, her voice tinged with both relief and desperation. "I took these children and hid them in my basement. I did it to protect them from becoming like all of you, judgmental and cruel." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Faces turned pale and eyes widened in disbelief. The executioner lowered his torch, and the judge, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. "Untie her," Elise commanded, her eyes locking onto the judge's. "Do it now." With trembling hands, the executioner untied Lena, who stumbled forward into her mother's arms. The crowd, still in shock, could only watch as the two embraced, their years of ostracization culminating in this single, redemptive moment. Elise was arrested and brought to trial. The town, still reeling from the revelations and their own collective guilt, sentenced her to a brief period in jail but ultimately decided on exile. As for Lena, she was finally free from the accusations and torment that had plagued her life, but the scars remained. One morning, the townspeople of St. Gallen woke to find that Elise and Lena had disappeared. Their small house on the outskirts of town lay empty, as if they had never existed. Despite numerous searches, they were never found, leaving the town to grapple with its collective guilt and the haunting memory of the injustices they had committed. And so, mother and daughter vanished, leaving behind a town forced to confront the dangers of prejudice, the consequences of collective hysteria, and the enduring power of a mother's love. Story 2: The Silver Salvation. In the year 1765, a remote village was tucked away in the labyrinthine valleys of the Carpathian Mountains. Surrounded by towering peaks and dense, dark forests, the village was a place where modernity had yet to encroach. The people lived simple lives, bound by tradition and a deep respect for the land that both sustained and isolated them. It was a community where everyone knew each other, where the problems of the outside world seemed distant, almost mythical. But this tranquil existence was about to be shattered, plunging the village into a state of terror it had never known. Within moments of their disappearance, the night was filled with strange, unsettling noises. Howls and barks that didn't belong to any known local wildlife, and the desperate, echoing screams of Thomas and Abby. The town guards, alarmed by the cacophony, rushed to the scene. Arriving just minutes later, they were met with a horrifying tableau. The couple had been savagely mauled, their bodies almost beyond recognition. As the guards surveyed the grim scene, they heard something. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, as if a large creature had retreated deeper into the woods. The initial assessment was both grim and bewildering. This was no ordinary animal attack. The wounds were too severe, the violence too extreme. It was as if a monstrous beast, both powerful and malevolent, had been the perpetrator. The village was now in the grip of a fear more potent than any it had known before. And as the news of the attack spread, some began to whisper that this seemed like the work of a creature similar to the infamous beast of Gévaudan, a wolf-like monster that had terrorized France a few years earlier, killing and mauling dozens before it was finally slain. The story of Gévaudan had traveled even to this remote village, adding a layer of dread to an already fearful atmosphere. Days after the initial attack, the town guard, now bolstered by volunteers, patrolled the area near the woods, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the mysterious beast. The tension was palpable. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl sent shivers down their spines. On one such night, the patrol's worst fears were realized. Emerging from the shadows, a monstrous figure lunged at them. Two guards, William and Henry, were killed almost instantly, their screams echoing through the night. The third guard, Robert, narrowly escaped, his uniform torn and his body covered in scratches. Breathless and terrified, Robert returned to the village and recounted his harrowing experience. He described the beast as wolf-like but far larger, with the ability to stand on its hind legs. Its front paws were more like hands, capable of grasping and tearing with terrifying strength. His account only intensified the villagers' dread, confirming that they were dealing with a creature unlike any they had ever encountered. Over the next 18 months, the village lived in a state of constant fear and vigilance. Attacks continued sporadically, always near the woods, always under the cover of darkness. The victims were indiscriminate. Men, women, and even children fell prey to the beast. The town was on edge. No one felt safe, not even within the walls of their own homes. Desperate measures were taken. Crossbows were armed, traps were laid, and prayers were fervently recited. But traditional weapons seemed to merely bounce off the beast's thick hide, and the heavens remained silent, as if the villagers' pleas for divine intervention fell on deaf ears. It was on a particularly dark night, when the moon was obscured by clouds, that the beast struck again. This time its target was the home of the Vasile family. The father, Stefan, was outside, securing the barn after hearing unsettling noises. Just as he was about to head back to the safety of his home, the beast lunged at him from the shadows. Stefan fought valiantly, but was overpowered by the creature's immense strength. Just as it seemed that he would meet the same gruesome fate as the others, a flash of silver sliced through the air. The beast let out an agonized howl and retreated, disappearing into the dark forest. Maria, Stefan's teenage daughter, had been watching from the window. Seeing her father in mortal danger, her eyes darted around the room for something to use. They landed on an ornate silver dagger, a family heirloom displayed on a nearby mantel. With no time to think, she grabbed it and rushed to her father's aid. It was the first time the beast had ever fled from a confrontation. Stefan, though severely injured, survived the attack. The town leaders, upon hearing of this miraculous intervention, summoned Maria for questioning. With a mixture of humility and pride, she showed them the blade that had saved her father's life. It was made of pure silver, intricately designed, but clearly more than just a decorative piece. The revelation was groundbreaking. Could it be that silver was the beast's weakness? The town's blacksmiths were immediately commissioned to forge silver-tipped crossbow bolts, and silver daggers were distributed among the guards. The villagers decided it was time to end the reign of terror once and for all. A plan was hatched to lure the beast into a trap. A dead pig was left at the edge of the forest, its scent carried by the wind into the depths where the creature was believed to dwell. Guards took positions on rooftops and behind barricades, their newly acquired silver-tipped crossbow bolts ready. As the night wore on, the tension reached a fever pitch. Then, just past midnight, the beast appeared. It approached the pig cautiously as if sensing the trap, but hunger, or perhaps some darker instinct, drove it to take the bait. The moment it touched the carcass, the night erupted in a volley of silver-tipped bolts. Over 50 were fired in quick succession, each finding its mark. The beast let out a final, ear-piercing howl before collapsing, lifeless, onto the forest floor. The next day, the lifeless body of the beast was displayed in the town square. It was a grim spectacle, but one that brought a sense of closure and relief to the villagers. The nightmare was finally over. In the years that followed, the story of the silver blade and the brave young girl who wielded it became legend. Though other attacks occurred in neighboring regions, the village was prepared. Guards armed with silver-tipped bolts patrolled every night, and hunts were organized to find and kill any similar beasts. And so, the tale of the village's horrifying ordeal became an origin story passed down through generations about why silver became known as the only material capable of slaying a werewolf. Story 3: The Wolves of Poligny. In the early 16th century, the French village of Poligny found itself at the intersection of tradition and emerging Renaissance thought. Nestled in the lush, rolling hills of the Franche-Comté region, Poligny was a place where time seemed to move at its own pace. The homes, constructed from local stone, and the well-trodden cobblestone paths created a sense of groundedness and history. The air was often filled with the delightful aroma of freshly baked bread and the distant laughter of children playing. Life in Poligny was simple but fulfilling. Fields were tilled, livestock were cared for, and community gatherings occurred in a harmonious cycle that was as predictable as the seasons. However, this tranquility was not to last. In the late spring of 1521, the atmosphere began to change. Whispers of unease turned into murmured prayers as the village found itself gripped by a fear it could neither understand nor explain. The first hint of darkness came when a local shepherd reported that one of his lambs had gone missing. It was initially written off as an unfortunate but not uncommon event. Perhaps a wolf had taken it. The predators were not unknown in the region. Yet as days turned into weeks, the village was rocked by a series of unimaginable horrors. Children began to disappear. At first, one, then two, and soon after, more. Worse still, some were found dead, their small bodies bearing gruesome signs of attack as though ravaged by some wild beast. As summer approached, the warmth of the sun did little to dispel the growing chill of dread that settled over Poligny. Parents held their children closer, their eyes flickering nervously towards the woods that bordered the village. Even the bravest of men hesitated to venture out alone, especially when the sun began its descent below the horizon. Each new disappearance, each new death deepened the sense of impending doom that enveloped the community. Villagers convened at the local church, lighting candles and offering prayers, but the comfort usually found in collective faith seemed elusive. As the days grew longer, the night brought with it a palpable tension that gripped every home and family in Poligny. In desperate times, the human mind seeks explanations wherever it can find them, often in the realm of the mystical and unexplained, and so stories began to circulate among the villagers. At first they whispered about ordinary wolves made rabid by an unusually harsh winter. But soon, darker theories took hold. Elders spoke in hushed tones about ancient legends, tales of men who could transform into wolves, lycanthropes. Could it be that such an abomination was responsible for their woes? Could it be that one among them was not who they seemed? As the body count rose and the nights seemed to stretch on endlessly, the community knew something had to be done. Relying solely on prayers was no longer sufficient. Action was needed. Thus, a council of village elders, along with some younger, able-bodied men, gathered in a hastily convened meeting at the town hall. Resolute but anxious faces looked from one to another as they debated their course of action. Finally, it was decided. Nightly patrols would be formed, traps would be laid near the woods, and armed groups would actively seek out the threat that lurked in the shadows. The people of Poligny were no longer willing to be prey. Whatever monster or monsters responsible for the devastation would be hunted down and dealt with by force if necessary. The villagers were now hunters, no longer willing to wait for the next horrifying event to unfold. Amidst the nightly patrols and tense atmosphere, rumors began to solidify into accusations. 3 names started to circulate within the panicked murmurs: Pierre Bourgault, Michel Verdun, and Philibert Monteau. Pierre, a loner who seemed more comfortable in the company of animals than humans, had been seen wandering the fields near where some of the children had disappeared. Michel, known for his dark sense of humor and sometimes unsettling demeanor, had made several cryptic comments that now seemed horrifically prescient. And then there was Philibert, a mysterious outsider who had only recently moved to Poligny, a man about whom very little was known. Word spread like wildfire that the trio had been found huddled together near the woods one evening, whispering amongst themselves. Whether it was a coincidence or damning evidence was debatable, but in the state of collective terror it was enough. A pair of hunters claimed they saw what looked like a ritualistic gathering. Whether it was their imagination or reality mattered little. These accounts were pieced together with their previous odd behaviors, weaving a tapestry of suspicion that proved impossible to ignore. The weight of the accusations hit the village like a tidal wave. Many had known Pierre, Michel, and Philibert for years. To consider them capable of such monstrosities was to rip at the very fabric of the community. Nonetheless, the terror was too palpable, the loss too great to give them the benefit of the doubt. As the sun dipped below the horizon one fateful evening, a group of villagers led by members of the council approached the homes of the accused. Torches flickered ominously as they arrested the 3 men, shackling them with heavy iron chains. Faces that had once been part of the community were now viewed through a lens of fear and betrayal as they were led to makeshift holding cells to await trial. The village of Poligny had its suspects, but at what cost? A community divided, families torn apart, and the haunting question that remained: had they caught the real monsters? Or were they yet to face an even darker truth? The council wasted no time. With the suspects detained, preparations for a trial and subsequent execution were hastily made. A wooden scaffold was erected in the town square, a grim stage where justice, or perhaps something darker, would be meted out. Blacksmiths were summoned to forge iron shackles and thick, cruel-looking chains. Meanwhile, villagers brought bundles of firewood, piling them high, a pyre that would soon be set ablaze to purge the community of its collective nightmare. The trial was as much a formality as it was a spectacle, a venue for the villagers to voice their grief, rage, and terror. Accusations were hurled, witnesses gave shaky testimonials, and the atmosphere was thick with tension. All eyes were on Pierre, Michel, and Philibert, who stood grim-faced, their eyes betraying little emotion. Under the weight of public sentiment and a mounting body of circumstantial evidence, they were found guilty of lycanthropy and sentenced to death by burning. On the appointed day, the village gathered at the square, their faces a mix of relief, grim satisfaction, and unspoken dread. The council members read the charges and the sentence aloud, their voices tinged with a gravity that reflected the grim nature of the occasion. The 3 accused were led up to the scaffold, chains clanking with each step. They were bound to stakes erected above the pyre, a chilling silence falling over the crowd as the executioner approached with a lit torch. As the flames began to climb, licking at the feet of the condemned, the villagers held their collective breath. There were no cheers, no cries of vindication, only the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a wolf, as if mourning or perhaps warning. Some looked away, unable to stomach the terrible reality unfolding before them. Others stared, transfixed, their eyes meeting those of the condemned men one last time. When it was over, when the last cries had been silenced and the last embers faded, a heavy sigh seemed to sweep through the crowd. Parents hugged their children a little tighter, tears streaming down faces that had seen too much. But even as the pyre smoldered, a sense of unease persisted. Had they cleansed their community, or had they allowed their fears to manifest into a horrifying act of collective violence? As the villagers dispersed, returning to their homes under the lengthening shadows, the council members remained, staring at the ash and charred remains. Their expressions were unreadable, caught somewhere between relief and remorse. They had done what they felt was necessary, but the price was a heavy one: a fractured community, friendships destroyed, and the gnawing, unanswerable question that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Had they extinguished the darkness, or had they become a part of it? And so, Poligny moved forward, its wounds cauterized by flame but never truly healing. Children still played, crops were still harvested, and life continued in its cyclical dance. But something had shifted, something intangible yet profoundly unsettling. For in their quest to cleanse the community, the people of Poligny had discovered that the most terrifying monsters were not always those that lurked in the woods, but those that could dwell within the hearts of men. And so we reach the end of our journey through these unsettling tales of werewolves, lycanthropy, and the darker corners of human nature. Each story took us on a journey through fear, suspicion, and the complexities of human emotion. But remember, only one of these tales is rooted in historical fact. So which one had you howling at the moon in disbelief? Was it the hairy child of St. Gallen, a story of prejudice and a mother's love? Or perhaps the Silver Salvation, where a village found its hero in a brave young girl and a silver blade? Or was it the Wolves of Poligny, a tale of a community torn apart by fear and the quest for justice? The true story among these is the Wolves of Poligny. Yes, in the early 16th century, the French village of Poligny was indeed gripped by a series of horrifying events that led to the trial and execution of three men, Pierre Bourgault, Michel Verdun, and Philibert Monteau, accused of lycanthropy. This case remains one of the most chilling instances of how fear and folklore can drive a community to extreme measures. While the story captures the essence of the events, there are some additional details that add layers of complexity to this grim chapter in history. For instance, the trial itself was a spectacle of its time, heavily influenced by the religious and superstitious beliefs that pervaded society. The accused were subjected to intense interrogations, often under torture, to extract confessions. In many such historical cases, these confessions were elaborate, describing rituals of transformation and pacts with the devil, further fueling the hysteria. Also, it's worth noting that the story of Poligny is not an isolated incident. The 16th century was a period rife with witch hunts and trials for various forms of heresy and supernatural crimes, including lycanthropy. The case of Poligny serves as a microcosm of the broader societal fears and the mechanisms by which those fears were judicially acted upon. The story of Poligny serves as a cautionary tale, urging us to question our own beliefs, our own judgments, and how we as a community respond to fear. Because sometimes the real horror is not in the existence of monsters, but in the actions we take when we believe we're surrounded by them.
Wow, you must be crazy about werewolves to make it to the end. If you want more content like that, subscribe to the channel and watch this video next. Else, next full moon, I'll leave you in the woods without any silver bullets.